Hi, this is Greg Hughes from 90 Second Website Builder. This is kind of a part 2 or a follow-up to another video that I did for you explaining the layout grid tool. So this is part 2, layout grid part 2, where I'm going to show you a couple more details and some practical uses of this great object. Now on the page right now, I have one layout grid, this one up here. And again, to make a layout grid, I click on it, draw a box, and you'll see it snaps into place. So now I have 2 grids. I'm going to select this one and delete it. What I'd like to do is show you how a layout grid relates to the objects or the content that you put inside the grid. In the last video, we kind of talked about managing the grid itself, managing the columns or the cells and that formatting. But let's talk about in this video what happens to the content you put inside those cells. So we're going to start with a couple of images, since you'll be working with images a lot. And I've got an image right here of a cute baby. And what we're going to do is we're going to put this image into one of these cells. Now, you'll notice that this is a pretty good size image, and my layout grid by default is pretty narrow. So how do we get this image into this space? Because if I just grab it like this and go up here, I can't always make it in there. Here's how you make it in there. You'll notice that my cursor, when my cursor and the image both cross into the grid, it lights up and lets me place the image. So in other words, let me take the image out again. If I try and put this image in with my cursor down here, it's hard to get it in there because my cursor is not making it into the grid too. So I need the image itself and the cursor to hover, if you will, as I drag. Now it's going to go in because you see it lit up. You see how it lights up with that blue highlight. Once I do that, it means I've made it into the grid. So it feels a little awkward because it looks like you're trying to stick a large image inside of a small hole. But as long as again, the cursor and the image both make it in, you'll be fine. So I'll let go, and there's our image. Okay, let's do it with another image. I have an image over here that's considerably different, and I'm going to put that in as well. Same situation, but now the grid's larger anyway, so we just go right on in. Now a couple of things happen that you notice right off the bat. First of all, this image snapped to the top, because everything does. Remember, everything snaps to the top. And you might say, well, what if I don't want that at the top? Remember, you have less control when you use a layout grid, but you don't have no control, you have some, and I'm going to show you how to fix that. The advantage of this layout grid, once again, is because it's going to make it easier and faster to make responsive websites. So before we make any changes to what's happening here, let's take a look at how our grid is set up now. So here are the properties. We're set on it being fluid. There's a little bit of gutter, and it's got no breakpoint. That's an important distinction right now because we're going to see the difference. And basically, this column is aligning to the left. This one's aligning to the left. And so that's what we have, a very basic default grid. Let's cancel out of here, and let's watch how this behaves when we preview. So I'm going to click F5 to preview so we can bring up this page in a browser. And let's just see how it behaves with these basic settings. There's our baby, there's our picture of Paris. And as we do this, we can see this is what it would do, which is not great. We want it to be responsive, but it's not really behaving the way you might think it should. The picture of Paris gets chopped up. The baby just kind of scoots over. Watch what we can do with the responsive grid. First of all, to demonstrate this, I'm going to take this image out and show you something really, really cool. When I double click on the image and go to its settings, you're going to see that there is an area down here that right now doesn't have any settings. When I move an image into a grid, that image now has a new section right here of settings. And one of them is called the full width layout. Now, by full width, it means the full width of the cell that it's in, because this setting only applies to this image when it's part of a layout grid. So I have 2 options, the full width and the maximum width. We're going to leave the maximum width, that's just fine. But let's change this full width to true, and we'll see what happens. I'm going to click OK, and I'm going to do the same thing over here. Again, when the image is not part of a grid, it just has the usual settings. By putting it into the grid, it picks up some new settings. We double click on it, and the image now has this option, full width layout. Let's make this true and click OK. Now you're going to see a big difference. When we preview, because we have chosen to do this full width trick, watch what happens when we shrink the browser width. Notice the image on the left, the picture of Paris, is no longer getting chopped. It is in fact scaling down, and so is the little baby. So as we get down to tablet size and mobile size, this makes much more sense. And it's just that one little tick of a box that gives you this kind of flexibility and responsiveness. A really important trick when you're working with content and the layout grid. Okay, so that's a big one, and that's working with images. Let's do another one here, but let's use this time, and I'm going to move the baby out of the way. Let's use a video. Same situation with a video. Notice videos are similar to images, except that they have something called an aspect ratio. I mean, images do too, but videos have to have an aspect ratio. It's very important. And in this case, the aspect ratio here is a 16:9, and that's typical for a YouTube video. Most of my videos are going to be 16:9, and that's common. You'll see a lot of videos like that. So that's an important thing to understand, first of all. Now, we're going to put this into the grid. Again, watch my cursor. I can't get it in there unless the cursor and the object cross into the cell. And now I've got a video in here. Now, if we go in and we check this box again, we'll have the same advantage. We're going to make this true. We're going to do an F5 so that we can preview it. Sometimes videos take a couple of seconds to display on the screen, so let's give it a couple. There it is. Now watch what happens. Notice it's scaling, just like the Paris picture is. And that's what that full width option does for us. So if this video was viewed on a tablet or something smaller, it wouldn't be out of proportion. And as it's on a desktop, it gets bigger. It works just fine. Very good trick. Now, not to confuse you, but that setting that we had only applied to the grid when this was inside the grid. If we check this box, fill entire browser window, that would make the whole page be video. That's something you would use if you wanted the whole page to be filled width-wise anyway, not height, but width-wise it would be filled with the video. We're not going to do that. We're only talking about when this is part of a grid. We do that again. There we go. Double click. And now this full width, it doesn't have to do with the browser. It has to do with the cell that it's inside. So in most cases, you're going to want this to be true. That's what I'm getting down to. So with images and videos and things like that, you're going to want this to be true. All right, so let's move on. Let's add another grid here. Let's get the layout grid tool. This time, let's work with some text. I've got some dummy text here that I have. And what we'll do is we're just going to drag this into this box. And this is really simple. Just so you know, the text is always going to accommodate, or I should say the cell is always going to accommodate the text no matter what. It's always going to adjust. Let's do a quick preview to see where we're at. And you can see that the text is always moving to fit, right? It's going to do whatever is necessary to fit. Another thing you should know about this is if I were to resize this page, right now I'm working with 970 just because that fits well in this video, but if we were to resize the page, notice that not only am I changing the size of the page, but the grid itself travels with it, and everything inside is going to have to be adjusted, and so it automatically does. So if I was going to make a page 1200 pixels wide, and that goes beyond the camera here, so let me go out here so you can see. I make a page 1200 pixels wide, you can see the text is accommodating, it's shifting, everything's working. This is one of the advantages of the grid. We've covered a couple of things here, and let's back up a little bit and talk about some of this spacing issue that we have. In this case, I have an image that is not as tall as the object next to it, and yet they share the same grid, and so we end up with this extra space here. And since content like images always hug the top by default, what if I don't want this at the top? Well, remember we have some control, and here's how we do that. If we double click on this grid, here we are, and we're going to work with this particular cell in the grid. Remember, what I can do is I can make this be a CSS Flexbox layout. Now, I won't get into the details of what that means, but basically when you check this box, it gives you the option to control the vertical alignment. And this is important. And right now it's top because that's always the default. But if I wanted to set this to middle, click OK, you can see that's what happens. And of course we could rest it on the bottom, as you can see. That's another great trick that will ease a lot of frustration when you're trying to put content in these boxes and make them work. Now remember, when you put an object like an image inside the same cell, they're just going to stack on top of each other. So you have to know that there are some limitations to that. So you might want to add another cell or add another grid and control the content that way a little better. So that's some of the basic tips and tricks and techniques I wanted to talk to you about. But I want to go over some other things, and this is really important. First of all, there are some objects that you should not use in a grid. This is one of the limitations. For all of the great flexibility of creating responsive pages with or without breakpoints, and all the advantages that that carries, some of the disadvantages, or some of the cost, if you will, of using a layout grid is there's some objects you shouldn't use, in fact can't use, inside a layout grid. One of those is a layer. A layer is an object all to itself. Now, you can use a layer on the same page as a layout grid, and that's actually very common to do. Sometimes we'll make our header be made out of a layer. That's a header layer, and the rest of the page be layout grids. But a layer cannot go inside the cell of a grid. Neither can forms. As I said in the other video, you can't put a form in here. However, you can make a grid be a form. Double click on it, open it up, and check this box. And now you can actually drag form objects into here, not the form itself, but the objects. And this layout grid is now functioning as a form, but you would never want to drag a form into it. Another thing you're not going to want to put in are most, if not all, jQuery objects. jQuery is a completely different protocol language, and you'll be frustrated if you try and put jQuery tabs or jQuery accordions inside the grid. So you'll want to stay away from that. Now, there are some things that you can put inside the grid that you probably still shouldn't because they aren't as flexible. And one of those is shapes or any of the drawing tool objects. If you look at the drawing tools, banner, clip art, curves, all these things, these are not responsive objects. These are something you want to use very carefully. And it's not something you necessarily want to put into a grid. Now, you can put them in here. However, you're not going to have quite the same scaling control that you do with images and videos and photo galleries and things that you should put into the grid. So another thing you should not put into the grid besides drawing tool objects are navigation objects. Now, again, you can, and we've put CSS menus in there, and you can, but just understand that if you put in, say, a navigation bar, something that's going to be less dynamic and more static, it's not going to adjust as well. So if you do put navigation into the grid, you're going to want to use text navigation or the CSS menu because it is more flexible and you can make it responsive. So just be aware that not all of the navigation tools are going to be best. They will go in there, but they won't necessarily respond as well. So there's a little bit of trial and error. So this whole layout grid thing is kind of a science all unto itself that you need to be aware of. Now, here's one other thing I want to say in this second video as we continue on with this discussion, and this is a little bit more advanced, and this will only apply to those of you who know what it means to make a responsive website with page variations. Remember, you don't have to use page variations, in other words, breakpoints, with your responsive design, but you can. And when you do, it gives you even more options and flexibility. Remember, we could set the breakpoint on these grids if we wanted to set 480 so that we could have a little different feel to the grid when the browser gets down to into the 480 range. And that's a good thing. But you can also add page breakpoints to the page like you would with responsive design and have different variations for the page, as well as the combination of this layout grid. Now, I know that sounds advanced, but for those of you who have been working with responsive design, this makes more sense. And what I'm about to show you might just blow you away, because this is a really cool feature. In fact, it's only available in 90-Second Website Builder version 12 and higher. And that is this. When you open up a layout grid, you have the option of making a particular column in this grid visible or not visible in this particular page variation. If that's too technical, don't worry about it. You may not need to know this, but again, if you're combining responsive design, meaning breakpoint page variation design, this is a very, very powerful technique. And even though it's slightly advanced, I want to include it because it's so important. So let's add a column here. So now we've got this grid here that has 3 different sizes, a 5, a 4, and a 3. Again, they always add up to 12. But what if on my, say my 480 breakpoint, I didn't want one of these cells to show because it's just too much content? I actually have the ability to hide that cell or that column in that specific breakpoint. So in that breakpoint, in that page variation, I'm going to have a 9.3 configuration. Whereas on another page, I might make that visible and have it be a 6.4.2 variation or 6.4.2 configuration for this layout grid. Right, so I realize I got really technical, and I want to be careful about that, but this is geared toward those of you who have some experience in working with the responsive design tools, and I'm showing you that combining these can be very, very powerful. But for the rest of you, if that's gone too far, at the very basics, you've now between these two videos, video about the layout grid, video number 1 shows you the basic overall view of how to manage the columns. And in this one, we've talked about putting content into the grid and some content that you probably shouldn't put into the grid. But this is a really powerful tool if you learn how to use it and play with it. And with it, you'll be able to make responsive websites in a really faster way, really, and a really organized way. And before we close this video, let me just say one kind of philosophical thing about this. One of the advantages of using the layout grid, probably the biggest advantage, is it does force you to be a better designer. And by that, I mean, because there are some limitations to what you can do, websites that are built with this grid tool have a tendency to be more organized and more clean and more lined up. One of the advantages of 90-Second Website Builder actually sometimes can cost you. And that advantage is being able to take an object and put it just about anywhere you want on the page. And that's great. However, sometimes we get messy and we have objects all over our page that aren't necessarily lined up, and it takes a little more work to do that. And sometimes people have a tendency to put too many things on a page. What the layout grid tool does is it sort of forces you to kind of clean up your act as a designer and make things line up in boxes and in grids and in sort of a structured way. Because remember, you can have more than 2 columns. I'm just showing you 2. You can have 12. You can also nest grids inside grids and begin to work in more of a structured way. So again, I'm getting kind of philosophic here on web design, but it really will help some of you. If we take a grid like this and we put it inside a cell, we can do this and have a layered, or sorry, a nested layout grid. If we double click on this one and we set this to Flexbox and we say we want this to be middle, watch what I'm doing here. I've now got a layout grid that's got a layout grid inside one of the cells. And now we can start to put content inside there and really control the look of the site and start putting things where we want to a degree. Not the same as fixed position that you're used to with the drag and drop software, but in a way that's going to really look professional and probably more cleaned up. So all that to say, I hope you learn how to use the layout grid and hope these videos help you do that, because there's some powerful things you can do to make a much better looking and more responsive website in a faster way using this great software called 90-Second Website Builder.